Good evening and welcome. I'm John Coatsworth. I'm the acting dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to say thanks to two people, to Susan Gittleson, who's made these policy forums possible and is here seated at the front of the room, and to Daniela, where's Daniela? There she is, who is our dynamic director of alumni relations and who is responsible for much of the organization of these events and making sure that we all get here in the right room at the right time on the right day. So thanks, Daniela. I also want to mention that our speaker this evening is just publishing a new book, which some of you may have noticed at the back of the room and is available for purchase. Our speaker is one of the major reasons why the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, SIPA, is such a great place. It's just remarkable, the human capital that has been pushed, stacked, squeezed into that building on the Columbia campus. We're bursting at the seams, not bursting with as many stars as we'd like, but one of the superstars on our faculty is Arvind Panagariya. Arvind is the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy and a Professor of Economics at SIPA. He came to us in 2004 and has since then been a major resource for our students and for our faculty who are interested in the emerging economies of the Third World, or what we used to call the Third World. India is part of this group of countries that we refer to as the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The amazing places that have, through rapid economic growth in the last few years, have suddenly emerged on the world scene as major players in both economic and political affairs. Arvind Panagariya is as you may know, holds a BA from Rajasthan University and a PhD in economics from Princeton. He has served in a number of important posts in international organizations and in academic institutions. He was, for a time, the chief economist at Asian Development Bank, and he has advised the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and UNCTAD in various capacities. He has published numerous books, edited journals, and is, among other things, well known for his contributions to India's leading newspaper, the India Times, the Economic Times, and it's India's top financial daily, and opinion pieces that you may have seen in newspapers that circulate in New York, like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. So it's a great pleasure to present to you not only one of the most distinguished members of our faculty, but also someone who, like many of our distinguished faculty, has published what is likely to be one of the most important books, certainly on its topic, in a long time. Professor Panagariya.
Thanks very much, John, for that wonderful, very generous introduction. This is the first time, actually, that I have you in my audience here, so I'm quite nervous, actually. Dean of my school, my examination here. Okay, so thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me start off with the subject. What I would do is give you an overview of what has happened in India. It's going to be a very quick kind of overview. It's a 55 years of history with my take on various events that have happened and how the economy and the country have evolved. India has had a very unique history from an economic standpoint. One of the things is that there was never a period in the last 55 years. So India became independent in 1947. Economic development process kind of was the institutionalization of various activities began around 1950. So we got 55 years of history. It never during this period has had this kind of period over the 55 years when like in Africa, for instance, you get these periods when there is turmoil and there is economically not only stagnation but decline and so forth. India never had faced that over the entire 55 years. Some growth continued to happen. But at the same time, unlike some of the East Asian countries like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., then Malaysia as well, India also did not actually have this superlative growth of 8 to 10%. It's kind of an economy which began nicely, began well, with high expectations, but then while it did not turn into disasters as sometimes in Africa and sometimes also in Latin America, actually there are periods of stagnation or decline. That did not happen. Nevertheless, India also for a long time actually did not fulfill its promise. In fact, in the 1950s, if you go back and look at the history, in the U.S. State Department, the view was that, look, Africa will do okay. Africa will come out of poverty. It is Asia that we are worried about. But at the same time, actually, within Asia, high hopes from India. So India was certainly among the countries that was seen as expected to do well, but it did not. In fact, about until almost 20 years ago, as recently as that, we used to joke that those economists who work on India are of two kinds, those who are optimists and those who are pessimists. Pessimists would say that, gee, things are so bad, I can't imagine them getting any worse. And optimists would say that, yes, I can. But that has now changed. That has now changed. Things have actually turned around. Currently, actually, to give you some idea of where things have come, currently, India is growing in real dollar terms. Now, there are various ways to calculate growth rates. And in real dollar terms, in the last 4 years, India has grown about 13% per year. So it's a phenomenal growth rate if you do in real dollar terms. The U.S. is growing maybe, in good times, is growing between 3 and 4%. And so compared to that, something like 13% is just phenomenal. If you project that growth rate over a 20-year period, for instance, and the U.S., let's say, grows at 3%, in 20 years' time, Indian economy will become about 2/5 of the U.S. economy. So it's a very large economy, and with China growing on the side about as fast or even faster than India. You can see in 20 years what kind of transformation we are looking at. The world is going to have multiple centers of gravity, at least on the economic side, and that obviously has political implications as well. So that kind of gives you an idea of where, if growth momentum is actually maintained, where we are heading. Now, other indicators, foreign direct investment and portfolio. So foreign investment, if you take together, in 1991, it was about a couple of $100 million into India. Today, taken together, it's about $30 to $35 billion. Phenomenal increase, actually. It's not quite to the level of China, but still quite dramatic. You got lots of Indians living abroad, working and prospering, and that shows up also in the remittances that go back to India. So currently it's something like, now again, to give a comparative, early 1990s, these remittances were maybe 2 billion or 3 billion. Today, they are somewhere between 25 billion and 30 billion. So again, very, very large increases, very, very rapid expansion. Telecommunications. Again, telecommunications is a huge story. 1991, you had something like 5 million telephone lines in all in India. So this is 5 million telephone lines put in place over a period of something like 40 years, 1950 to 1991. About 40 years, 5 million telephone lines. Today, currently, monthly, India is adding something like 8 million telephone lines. So it's just phenomenal. It's a flow just 1 month, which is 8 million, and so you can the tally density, which was something like 1, meaning telephones per 100 of population, which was 1 or less in 1990. Today is about 23 or 24. So it really is phenomenal penetration. Automobiles, again, and you have all, I'm sure, heard about that. The nano car, Tata's nano car, which has been very much reported into the news lately. But again, from a few 100,000 initially in 1990s, today India is putting out something like 1.3 million automobiles on the road every year. And that number is rising rapidly at the rate of 20-25% a year. So the Indian roads can't keep up with the number of automobiles that's coming on the road. And civil aviation, again, the same way, the growth of traffic on civil aviation, both passengers as well as freight, growing at 20-25% a year. Software industry, of course, is a well-known success story, which is now about $30-35 billion worth of exports from that single industry. So these are the kind of symptoms. That's the kind of action that has been unleashed in the last about 20 years, and this is going to continue. Now, the commonest, of course, issue that's raised is that, well, what has it done for the poor? And the general impression, even as I kind of, sometimes on my very recent trip, actually, as I was exiting India, the immigration officer in New Delhi sort of, began to ask me, what do you do? And as I'm a professor, and where do you teach? Columbia, etc. So, but what is happening in India? And so, I started telling him nice things. So, but what has it done for the poor? And the impression kind of is as if this is, something that's the growth that one is witnessing is largely kind of in the urban areas, and mostly it's benefiting the rich and maybe a little bit of the upper middle class, but the poor are being left behind. That just isn't true, actually. In fact, there is now very systematic evidence, very compelling evidence that growth has actually brought poverty rates down quite dramatically. So, if one goes by the national poverty line, which is approximately about $1 a day at purchasing power parity, the poverty ratio, meaning that the proportion of the population that's living below the poverty line, was about 45% in the early 1980s. It is now down to about 27%. So again, these numbers one can't take serious because it all depends on how poverty line is defined and so forth. It's a change that is dramatic. I think one has to look at the change that has growth helped the poor, and there is no doubt, actually. I mean, you can look at the rural poverty, you can look at the urban poverty, you can look at the national poverty. Poverty ratios have dramatically come down, and one can. And it shows. I mean, if you visit countries periodically, you can certainly see, whether you visit the countryside or you visit the urban India, you can see. I mean, it's not purely the numbers, but also the visibility. There's issues of inequality. Maybe I'll, since I want to cover a little bit more territory. I mean, in a way, what happens is that when for a while, actually, the debate in India was about has poverty declined or not. Now that's kind of convincingly shown by the numbers. So now the debate from the other side has shifted to arguing that but it has increased inequality. That again is at least in the numbers it doesn't show. At least in the national inequality figures, inequality in India certainly has not risen. Now there are other forms of inequality, the regional, like some parts of India growing far more rapidly than other parts. So you got states in the south, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, which is kind of a bit in the middle, and then on the north, Punjab, Haryana, they are growing much more rapidly. Then some of the other states, like at the other extreme, you got Bihar and Orissa, which have grown much more slowly. So, regional inequality has risen. Rural-urban inequality has risen as well. I argue in my book that this is not something that we should really lose much sleep over. Let me just, leave that here in the discussion. If you want to pick it up, I can come back to argue why I think so. Looking to the future, again, my own view is that long-term predictions are just that. You can't quite, you can't quite take them too seriously. Meaning, again, I go by the experience that when India started in the 1950s. It was Korea that was thought of as being the basket case, and that India was going to perform like a star, and Korea was going to be something that for which nothing could be done. In fact, in the U.S., actually, the foreign aid to Korea was drastically cut, actually, on the presumption that they were not going to be able to use it properly, productively. And in the end, in the following 2 decades, by 1980, actually, Korea had become, a middle-income country, and India had turned into a basket case. So predictions, as we try to do, and you have all heard about the BRICS report, which tries to kind of project this over 30, 40 years. One can't take it too seriously. But nevertheless, having said that, I think there are reasons to be quite optimistic, actually, that India is likely to continue to grow. There are a number of reasons, but 2 or 3 let me mention. Demographically, India is going to be turning much younger. So it's already a relatively young population, but it is going to get younger, actually, in terms of the age composition, which is the opposite of what is happening in most other countries. And that, of course, means that it opens up lots of opportunities for the Indians. Not only that means more savings, because your dependency ratios are much lower, but also because the other opportunities that get opened up is that when the rest of the world's population is growing older, through migration, opportunities for these people actually get opened up. I suspect that in the next 20 years, you would see a hell of a lot more migration out of India than it is currently. So, for instance, as an example, currently about 40,000 Indians every year are coming out to get education in the United States, Australia, Canada, and the UK. If you if you put a reasonable rate of growth on that population in the next 20 years, you're talking of more than a million young Indians, very highly educated, very highly motivated, coming out to seek education, and you'll see Vikram Pandits and so forth in high positions currently in the United States. That process, I think, is going to actually intensify. So that you see the outward investment that's going on from India. The recent purchase near agreement to buy Jaguar from Ford by Tata. Its purchase of Arcelor in the steel sector. Then you got, of course, Lakshmi Mittal's major kind of acquisitions in the steel industry. The outward investment by itself, actually, by the Indian companies in this last year, for instance, was about like $35 billion. It's quite phenomenal, actually. It's more than what China has acquired abroad, even though India is almost about, I would say, 10 years behind China in the growth process. So then the savings rate in India has picked up. It's about currently 33-34% of the GDP, which is a very high savings rate, and the scope for further expansion of the savings rate remains, actually, because corporate savings in India are still relatively low, about 1/4 of what they are in China. So the scope for expansion of corporate savings is much more. So easily the savings rate would rise to about 40% or so in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, which again is one of the important ingredients in speeding up growth process. So that's the kind of what has been happening in recent years, what is to come. But now I want to step back a little bit, give you a little more historical what went wrong. So what went wrong in 1950s, India started off, and my kind of favorite comparison, which again I develop in chapter 6 of the book, is with Korea. So Korea and India in 1950s pretty much grew about similar rates of 4%. And what happened in the early 1960s was that Korea basically found that its aid was being cut off, and internal growth momentum was low. It made a very clear decision that it could no longer kind of rely on this import substitution model where you protect against imports to encourage domestic industries. It felt that it had done that at least in labor-intensive products to the extent that it could push. Now the issue was, do you go into capital-intensive industries like steel, automobiles, etc., through protection, or you actually become outward-oriented? Korea made the decision that it was going to actually become outward-oriented. So it in a major way devalued the won, the currency, which made its exports more attractive, imports more expensive, and it also then began to systematically kind of dismantle protection, particularly on the raw materials and machinery. And that really had a phenomenal impact, actually. India went exactly the opposite way. Rather than open up, it progressively became more and more inward-looking. So whereas, by the time we come to 1980, Korea's economy had grossly opened up. Exports were rising something like, during this period, about 23, 24% in real terms per year. I mean, that's a phenomenal growth in exports, actually. And so, by the end of the day, its exports to GDP ratio had gone to something like 30% by 1980. India was like 5%. In fact, the Indian economy actually became more inward-looking. The trade to GDP ratio actually declined rather than rise. And that had detrimental effect in all sorts of ways. I mean, I like to, in India particularly, I like to give this example that, if cricket is the big passion in the country, and the way I like to put it is that, look, if you're going to want to produce world-class cricket players, you've got to play Test cricket. If you're going to play only the domestic, provincial and state level cricket, you're not going to produce the world-class cricket players. And it's the same with products, and in my own pursuits of academics, if you're an academic and you're really writing in your protected domestic market, you're not going to excel. I mean, in the end, you excel if you really operate in the world markets, compete against the best in the world, and in effect, this autarkic model, the very protectionist model that India adopted in the 50s and which really became much more so in the 60s and 70s, really led to huge decline in the productivity, and the quality of the products, of course, suffered incredibly. There's a very interesting kind of episode, Jagdish Bhagwati, after whom my chair is named. In the early 1960s, he returned to India. He'd been to in UK and the US briefly, and then returned to India. And at the time, like everybody else from his generation, he too had these very nationalistic kind of feelings. So out of this nationalism, he happened to write to his professor, Harry Johnson, who was also a very famous trade economist, and if he had lived long, probably would have been awarded a Nobel Prize. So he wrote to Harry Johnson, "Dear Harry, it really bothers me that there is so much craze for all kinds of foreign goods in India. It just doesn't seem right." So Harry Johnson writes back saying, "Look, if the quality of the paper on which your letter was written is an indication of the quality of the goods, I think the craze for the foreign goods is quite rational to me." And that's kind of, you can see, how those of us who grew up actually during this period know precisely, what the products used to be like. We used to joke, that there are these fountain pens. So they got it half right, they were certainly fountains, but whether they were pens or not. So in a way there was, and this was all kind of being generated by the policy regime. I mean, on the one hand, I have mentioned the fact that trade channel got cut off, but domestically also, what India did was to institute very strong investment licensing. So, any investment that required maybe more than $1 million worth of investment in machinery and plant machinery and building, which is, not very large, even by the standards of those days, it was a very small investment. You required a license, and the government would then decide whether you actually can make that investment or not. And side by side to that, there was another policy that was created. It was called the Small Scale Industries Reservation. And so what that policy did was to reserve a large number of most labor-intensive products, apparel, toys, footwear, most of the products that require a lot more unskilled labor. They were reserved for what were called the small scale industries. Now, these small scale industries, again, are very small. Investment up to $1 million or so, perhaps a little less. So what that meant was that, in these sectors, you simply could not get the large scale. And that, of course, again, is going to affect your productivity. If you are such a small operator, such a small entrepreneur, you're not going to operate in the world markets at all. You're not going to be an exporter, because you just have no incentive to discover larger markets, because even if you discover larger markets, you'll not be allowed to export. And so, this was a very kind of retrospectively looking a very irrational policy, and this fed back into the attitudes. There was a very nice cartoon actually that India's leading cartoonist R.K. Lakshman once had in the Times of India, where this minister kind of is the Minister of Industry is talking to his staff and saying that I know that it is our. So this was also because there was this strong kind of concentration of economic power or concentration of wealth view among the policymakers. So every time they're fighting to keep the industry small, to keep the firms small, that otherwise there is concentration of power, concentration of wealth. So which is where this whole very kind of egalitarian, equality-driven policies. So this minister is sitting down saying that I know, I understand what you are trying to argue, that we should it is our policy not to allow big firms. But I say that we shouldn't allow small firms either, because if we did allow them, they'll certainly grow larger. And so, so it is really a huge stranglehold on the policies, both on the trade side and on the domestic. So, competition can come from two sources, domestic or outside trade. But both sources effectively actually got cut off. And that had a detrimental effect on productivity as well as the quality of the products. Now, by mid-1980s, it began to be felt actually that this model was not working. Partly this was happening through the examples of the Far Eastern economies that were doing very well, and India's own experience where actually the economy had not been doing well. So also I think politically, in 1984, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated and her son, Rajiv Gandhi, became Prime Minister, who was younger. He was a young man, had actually studied in UK, so had been exposed to the outside world, and so his aspirations were different also. So he really kind of wanted to take India to the 21st century, and that's what his inaugural speech actually was about. And initially when he started off, so he started off the process of liberalization in 1985, 1986. A couple of years it went very well. Actually, at the time, that raised expectations, in fact, and at the time, Wall Street Journal actually had either an editorial or an op-ed piece which kind of said, Rajiv Reagan, because remember at the time Reagan was very much a pro-market president the United States had, and the similar kinds of expectations or aspirations kind of were seen in Rajiv Gandhi. In the end, he couldn't really carry on his liberalization process very far. He got entangled into political kind of scandals and so forth, so it didn't go far enough. But nevertheless, some bit of liberalization, some bit of expansionary policies allowed the growth to begin. And in the last 3 years of the 1980s, India did grow at a much faster pace. In the last 3 years of the 1980s, growth was about 7.5%. But partly this growth was fueled by the reforms by the liberalization that Rajiv Gandhi had undertaken, but very largely it was also driven by expansionary fiscal policies and a lot of borrowing abroad. So at the time, the external borrowing was in relation to the size of the economy was getting large, and that eventually led to a crisis. So there was a balance of payments crisis in 1991. And at that time, again, India got a new Prime Minister, Narasimhan Rao, and again here, this is again an example of where the leadership kind of matters. Now, by this time also, there are two other events which really made a big difference in terms of the thinking at the political level. One was the demise of the Soviet Union. So there was a clear sense that, the Soviet model, which is what India had adopted in the 1950s, really was not working. Once Soviet Union itself collapsed, any argument that we could actually achieve through planning what the markets do in other countries was really it no longer held any water. Second very important event that made that caused the policymakers to rethink their strategy was the growth of China. I mean, China really kind of took off under a very liberal set of policies. Now, in India, if again for those of us who grew up in India during that period, this is a country with a very intellectual tradition and very argumentative country. So anytime you gave examples like, how Korea was doing so well, but Korea is small, whatever Korea does is not of any relevance to us. Singapore, oh, that's a city-state, our problems are different. We got such a large population, and population was really seen as the big problem. But, once China, which was even larger than India, took off, all arguments actually fell through. And that kind of got driven home to the politicians. And so 1991, when a new prime minister came in, Narasimhan Rao, he clearly wanted to set the house in order. And that's the time he brought Manmohan Singh, our current prime minister, as the finance minister, and basically systematically got the economy opened up. So that is the time both kinds of licensing, the investment licensing, which regulated the investment as to where you could invest and where you could not invest, as well as the import licensing, which meant what could you import, what could you not import. They were both largely kind of dismantled. There's a big reform. Now you opened up competition from outside. You also opened up competition domestically. Investors and entrepreneurs became freer to invest where they wanted to invest. And one thing, of course, you can say is that India's entrepreneurs are really the best, actually. And here again, there's a very nice way a leading lawyer actually in India, Nani Palkewala, used to put the matter. He used to say that Indian entrepreneurs are just about the best, and it takes a lot to suppress their animal spirits. But our bureaucrats have got the talent. And so, when that hand of the bureaucrat got lifted off, the entrepreneurship really found its expression in virtually all directions. One of the leading sectors was, initially at least, was the software industry. And that's, you can see why that happened, actually. Everywhere else the government could control. But software exports were going on the wire, which they really couldn't see. And so it's simply because they couldn't control it that sector really took off. And then, so once that began to happen, two big reforms in 1991, the investment licensing gone off, free trade, and at least the import licensing also virtually removed. Consumer goods took another 10 years. Consumer goods imports were still subject to licensing until 2001. That actually required a challenge by the United States in the WTO, where the US won, to the good of India, actually, and that licensing on consumer goods was also lifted off in 2001. And the tariffs then externally came down. You would not believe, but the top tariff rates in India in 1991, when the systematic reforms began, was 350%. There was 350%. Now the top tariff rate on industrial goods is down to about 10%. So on industrial side, services also got liberalized quite dramatically because foreign investment was freed up. Again, foreign investment was largely not permitted prior to 91, but it's now opened up, so you're getting very large amounts of foreign investment. Most foreign companies are operative in India, and so forth. So that also introduced yet another element of competition, and that also actually, foreign investment is the career of new technology, and so the technological advancement progress was very dramatic. And in some of the sectors, you can see, the automobiles that we used to have as late as 1990s, early 1990s, were the automobiles actually produced everywhere else in 1950s. The model of the Ambassador and Fiat that was still selling had not changed, but not today, of course. As you can see, within a matter of 15 years, India comes in as a leading producer of, at least, not on the kind of scale of the US, but certainly in terms of on the technology side, Tata kind of pioneers this car, which is the talk of those coming to Detroit, actually, even when the car itself is not even present at the show. So that's the kind of measure of how much change being open can make. So I think that tells us the power of competition, and in this sense, I think this is India. India is a good example for other countries that indeed with right policies. With right policies, you can really make a difference. Now, let me just, if John, may I take just 3 or 4 more minutes? Okay, thanks. So let me just, where this is headed, where I see the big problem. Okay, where I see the big problem. Now, growth, etc., everything else is going quite well. But there is one major issue which India has to grapple with, and that is that about 55% of the workforce, again, precise numbers, these are based on surveys and so forth. So how precise they are is not very clear. But ballpark, 55% of India's workforce is still in agriculture. Okay. Now, because the rest of the economy has grown very rapidly, and agriculture by nature doesn't grow so rapidly. If agriculture is growing at 4%, that's pretty damn good. But if the rest of the economy is growing at 8 to 9%, then you know that the composition of the economy is changing against agriculture. But at the same time, if your workforce is not rapidly moving out of agriculture, what you would find is that proportionately, a lot of workers are in agriculture, but a lot of income is not in agriculture. So if you take core agriculture only, about only 16 or 17% of the national income is originating in agriculture. And workforce, about 55% is in agriculture. That obviously, has huge implications for transforming the economy. Even if, in terms of the GDP, national income, you transform the economy, modernize it, but in terms of the population where it is, it's not modernized. So the big problem India faces, of course, is that moving this workforce out of agriculture into non-agricultural activities. Now, in most countries, almost every country which has industrialized, you can take Korea, you can take currently China, before that, you can take Brazil. When industrialization happens, generally or growth happens from initial levels of income, agriculture's share shrinks, both in employment and in income, and labor force moves into industry. Across the board, but India happens to be unique, actually, that industry, manufacturing in particular, but industry in general, if you want to take that, has not grown more rapidly than the GDP itself. So the share of industry in income or share of manufacturing in income has not changed in the last 20 years. So manufacturing share was 17% in 1991. It is still about 17%. If you take industry altogether, it was about 25, 26% in 1991. It's still 25, 26%. Employment is even worse, actually. And particularly if you take the organized industry, organized manufacturing, which includes largely the corporate sector, then employment in that sector has actually been declining. So any movement out of agriculture, some of it has happened, not very rapid, has actually happened, largely in the informal sector of the industry or of services. What has grown much more rapidly in India is not industry but services. And again, by services, we often here want to kind of think in terms of the software industry or banking or financial sector and so forth. But it's not just that. And that's, in any case, that's not where bulk of workers are. Software industry, even today, employs only 1.5 million workers. So it's not large. Likewise, the financial sector is not a big employer, certainly not of the unskilled workers. So you got the unskilled workers more in the kind of, more traditional services, informal sector and so forth. And the industry is not absorbing the labor force in a big way. Now, why is that not happen? Unlike in all the other countries which have transformed themselves from primarily agricultural to industrial economies, in India, the labor-intensive industry, unskilled labor-intensive industry has not done well. Meaning, you take apparel, you take textiles, you take footwear, you take toys, light industries, consumer goods. All of the products that we all are used to buy from China, right? They're made in China. You go to any of these light consumer goods, labor-intensive products, they're made in China. In those sectors, India has not done well. And I think there are reasons for it in infrastructure, particularly power sector, which is not doing very well, which has still not delivered on its own. But my own take is that one other really very important factor at work are the labor laws of India. Now, India got a social revolution well before the economic revolution. So in India, the labor rights, especially in the organized sector, well, not especially, but basically in the organized sector, are very highly protected. I mean, the level of protection is astounding, actually, to the point that, if a firm wants to even reassign a worker from task A to task B, it is almost impossible. I mean, you have to give the workers a notice of 3 weeks, and then the worker can actually dispute it, and it goes to the labor courts, where it languishes. And in any case, if there is a decision, it's almost always in favor of the workers. That's one. But more importantly, it is almost impossible in the organized sector to fire the workers. What that means is that, so if you employ 100 workers or more, if you are a firm employing 100 workers or more, it is impossible to fire the workers in India. Even if you go bankrupt, you still cannot fire the workforce. You still have to pay the workforce using the profits of your other firms. And firms that manage to kind of, get out of it, what they usually do is not pay the electricity bill. The electricity gets cut, and then they can put a lock on the factory, and then they just move out of the state. Then, of course, the government has to come in and take over and pay the workers. So the labor law. So what that does, of course, is that anybody who is producing labor-intensive products knows that 80 or 90% of my costs are labor costs, and that they are very reluctant to enter on a large scale. So you can look at the apparel industry in India versus apparel industry in China. You'll see in China, thousands of workers working under a single roof in that sector. In India, largest you will see is 50 tailors employed in a single firm. So you don't get the kind of scale that you require, the kind of employment that you need to create actually in the labor-intensive sectors. That's just not happening. So that's a tough one. No political party seems to want to take the risk. Actually, every political party has in its wing an organized labor union, to which it is kind of beholden, to which it is it remains answerable so politically. And so that reform really, in the previous government under Vajpayee had tried to push this reform, but in the end it backed off. So I think that's a bit of an aspect of the reform process which makes me a little bit pessimistic. So, but I think in the end, it'll not happen immediately, but maybe in the 10 years' time it'll happen. One final area I would mention, which is the higher education. This feeds into, of course, all the leading sectors of the services, the software industry, etc. I think India's higher education system is in really bad shape. It's really collapsing, if you ask me. You might think here of IITs and IIMs, but that's about it. If you look at the university system, it's really collapsing. Expansion is very slow. That is a sector which is not delivering. Again, the thinking on the reforms in that sector is well behind the curve. Again, not very much is, in terms of the serious reform, not very much is happening. Just as an example, there are virtually no private universities in India because the entry barriers are so huge that hardly any universities can actually enter. So these are the kinds of problems with which India will have to grapple in the next 10 to 15 years. So while one has to be, while I remain very optimistic about what is to come, one has to be a bit cautious of the bottlenecks that also India faces. Thank you very much.
The floor is now open to questions.
Thank you for being so comprehensive and so enlightening. Now, you mentioned China, and the Prime Minister of India just paid an important visit to China. How would you compare the development that is now taking place, and what do you see as the possibilities for cooperation as well as competition between India and China?
Okay, thanks. It's a good question. And thanks for your generous compliments. I think India and China, of course, are different, purely because, politically, India has been a democracy for 55 years, or 60 years, really. And in this sense, I think, the particular transition that China still has to do, India has done. So at least, some people like to call it some fixed cost that you have to upfront pay, and India has done that. And how China comes out of, how China transitions out of its current political system into democracy, that remains a bit of a question. Now, in terms of the scope for India-China, just huge. I think it's just huge. Within a very short period, like 10 years' time or something, China was insignificant in India's trade, but it's now its second largest trading partner. There is talk of an India-China free trade area agreement also, an FTA between India and China. Indian side is a little scared right now of the Chinese kind of flooding its markets with the cheaper manufacturers and so forth. Again, protectionists have not died in India yet. They're still alive and assertive. So, and currently they got, the current government has not been particularly aggressive in opening up. And this is not the Prime Minister himself, Manmohan Singh. He is a tradesman, and he understands the benefits of trade. But I think the country is, in these matters, being governed by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who doesn't share that view. She is very much kind of surrounded by the socialists who had lost out in 1991 but are back into play because she does indulge them. And I think so on the Indian side there is reluctance to do free trade area with China. But I think it will happen in 10 years' time.
There is a microphone, so perhaps if when I call on you, if you could wait for the microphone to arrive and also say your name and anything else you'd like to say as introduction to your question. There was a question up here.
Hi, Eric Tucker, class of '84 at SIPA. And I was a China focus there. So looking at the capital markets, which you didn't mention that much, the exchanges in India are much older than in China. And I was just wondering, in China also you have tremendous kind of gambling mentality that's driving these fluctuations that don't seem to have any relation to underlying value of the companies. And in India, I'm just wondering, do you have more depth in the capital markets? Is more of the economy covered? It seems like in China, the public markets still only reach a very small part of the economy. And how would you compare the two capital market sectors? Thank you.
Yeah. No, in general, financial sector in India is better developed than in China. It's not only because of the history that the exchange itself is very old, but also India began to set its house in order in the financial sector much earlier than China did. So banks, for example, are clearly in much better shape. Now, specifically to the capital market, again, it's still not a very deep market in India. My own read is that a lot of the fluctuations, both in China and India, are coming from the foreign capital moving in and out. When interest rates in the U.S. decline, a lot of capital rushes out, and even if a small fraction of that goes into the Indian market, given the size of the Indian market, that still is quite large, and that really leads to that kind of boom, and that same argument holds for China also. So you can see, I mean, if you're watching the stock market in India, it really, this was a week ago, right, and in a matter of a few minutes, the market fell by 10%. I mean, I've never heard, anywhere in a matter of minutes, not like, it was like 10 minutes, and there was a 1,500 point decline actually in the market, which is about 8 or 9% of the decline. But then 2 days later or 3 days later, it went back up. So there is a huge amount of obviously speculative element. There are also big players, like the two Ambani brothers, Mukesh Ambani and Anil Ambani, which kind of are the leading industrialists, two top industrialists actually. The speculation is that they speculate in that market themselves actually and cause some of these fluctuations. But so presence of big players, both domestic ones as well as the foreign institutional investors. I mean, in a way, you would think that foreign institutional investors are the ones that will be guided by the activities of the local actors, simply because local actors are likely to have more information. But in the Indian market, it's just the reverse, actually. The moment the foreign investors kind of move in and out, the herd mentality really follows those actions. So Okay, so broadly, I think the financial markets are still on the whole better developed in India, and maybe capital account convertibility will ultimately will probably come faster in India than it will come in China, but both markets are thin.
In the back.
You noted that Indian firms are expanding rapidly, and there are a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And this is something that will probably continue as these industries continue to grow. And we've heard of very public mergers and acquisitions that have fallen through, like CNOOC or the Dubai ports. Do you foresee any Indian firms trying to make large moves in the developed economies, and whether they will run into any kinds of obstacles that might be similar?
Yeah, I mean, these things will happen. These things will happen. And we saw recently, I suppose that's what you're referring to, that when Tata was trying to acquire Jaguar, and then there was also some talk about Tata trying to acquire Orient Express, and the dealerships of Jaguar kind of went ballistic, saying that, oh, this really dilutes our trademark. And this was same thing was with Orient Express. It wrote a letter to actually Ratan Tata, the head of the Tata Group, saying that don't even think of buying us. Our brand is far too good to be. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it, but that was the sense of it. Now, Indian press, of course, went berserk on that, racism, etc. But, these are all strategic, tactical things that happen. Ratan Tata himself was cool. In the case of Orient Express, he wrote telling him that be careful, I'll sue you. And in the case of Jaguar, he quietly kept going, and it seems that the deal will come through. So, I think, this kind of resistance will come, but I don't think it has a lot. I mean, there is certainly we tend to think that because this is a developing country trying to acquire a developed country firm, developed countries don't want it and they resist. But in all acquisitions, these things happen. So my take on this is that, one has to play the game. And if you do that, you'll succeed, as Tata has succeeded, and as a lot of other Indian companies have actually succeeded in acquiring. So strategic play will happen, and it's not related so much to the fact that the acquiring firm happens to be from a developing country. I'm sure if this was a brand that was unknown, say from UK, which tried to do the acquisition, a similar kind of reaction might come from Orient Express or Jaguar.
All right, I'll give you my cafeteria voice. I don't need this.
Sure.
Okay. I'm an owner of some Tata stocks, but forget about that. What you have not discussed is education. You did mention higher education. As someone who has been to India, I couldn't believe what I saw. I'm in Mumbai, and I'm looking, and I look at, this is a large community, and I go to this slum community, and I am visiting a school. It's a school that was created by somebody in the United States, a young woman who was for Teach for America and wants to develop something called Teach for India.
Mm-hmm.
She came back. And who's supporting this school? The local financial firms, Merrill Lynch, all of that. And they have a very nice school going. But it's minuscule when you think about what needs to be done in India.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Okay. So
the
it's
labor laws of India. I mean, you mentioned wonderful things.
right.
But you can't grow a country unless the educational system is there.
Right. Okay. So I touched on higher education, the primary education. Progress has happened actually quite a bit. Now, where the problem is that the government insists on delivering. So much of the education, at least in the rural areas, is public. Some private schools have now come up, so things are beginning to change. But my take in the book is that the government actually ultimately needs to recognize the fact that its ability to deliver is very poor. And this also goes for health, by the way. So there's a chapter on health, which makes yes. So the way I argue is that, look, on primary education, even maybe up to secondary, but certainly up to for primary education, you need to give people, at least the bottom 30% of the population, vouchers. Let them choose between private and public schools. Much of the evidence I have seen, at least from within India, between private and public schools, private schools deliver far, far better service for a fraction of the expenditure that the state schools do. I mean, teacher salaries in the lowest rung of private schools, which end up doing better than the public schools, the salaries are 1/7, 1/6 of the teachers in the public schools. But the absenteeism is much lower, both of the students as well as the teachers. And when you do the test scores, they do much better. So I think in India, the government has to get out of this mentality of insisting on providing through the public schools. Let the people choose.
Good evening. My name is Michael Billett. Class of 79, but actually was SIA before the controversial P was added. I wonder if you might just comment on the status of women. I've just returned from a visit to India, and if you subscribe to the theory that the performance of a country is directly related to the emancipation of its women, I think India has a real problem, because in law, women are relatively emancipated, and in fact completely emancipated in many places, and we do see instances of women rising to the highest positions here and there. But as a practical matter, throughout the country, I think you could almost see enslavement throughout all kinds of communities and even industries. And I wonder how that is going to play out in terms of some of the problems that you outlined. And I'm putting it to you because I don't hear anybody discussing it at any levels.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at the, what you're referring to this is the level, and economists like to look at the change. And the change is certainly in the right direction. If you, again, look at the workforce today versus what it was 25 years ago, dramatic changes. Women are very much present in from the top down to the bottom and so forth. In the end, though, I mean, this ties into the earlier question on education. In the end, the freedom and emancipation, to me, are through education. And insofar as female education has been less valued by the families and the government, that also accounts to a very large degree for the lack of emancipation. So I would really, push that again, particularly female education, both at the primary, secondary, and higher levels. That ultimately is the way to go. I mean, you can pass a lot of laws, and as you say, actually, I mean, social revolution, and as I said, the way I put it earlier was the social revolution in India came especially in terms of the legal framework and the laws. Much earlier than any other kind of revolution. The economic revolution has to reach women also, and that I think is going to ultimately be the practical salvation on that front as well. But I remain quite optimistic because the change certainly is happening, and the level of confidence that I see in the women in India is just phenomenal. So, I mean, I think you painted a little too pessimistic picture. Those of us who have dealt with the women in India, really today. We sometimes, my friends joke that, we are all married to women who are intellectually more advanced than most of us are. But ultimately it's education.
We only have time for a few more questions, so what I'm going to do is to ask 2 or 3 people to give questions, and then I'll ask Professor Panagariya to answer them all at once, starting here.
Just a quick question about in the book. Do you in the book do you talk about environmental and social sustainable development perspectives? As an economist, there was once an assumption that we went from agrarian to industrial, and clearly that's not the case anymore. And so India is a country we're all watching in the world. And I just wonder, you as an economist and your colleagues, what kinds of perspectives you're looking at for different ways of development.
And since we're on the subject, there are two women who have very important questions to ask in the row just behind, and I think I can't ignore them.
Thank you. With the increasing in economic development and other development in India, can you tell us whether there's a reduction in the brain drain, or is it still a very negative aspect of in the Indian overall picture? And if so, what can be done about it? Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on the environmental question and focus on energy. And I'm particularly interested in your comments on the idea of a United States-India arrangement with respect to the transfer of nuclear technology for nuclear energy. Thank you.
One more on this side.
Yes, my name is Miu Mian, 2007 alumni. I'm the neighboring country of India from Burma. I'm from Burma. So I'm very happy to share the growth of India economy. So I'd like to know whether the growth India economy is supporting or the threatening regional economy as well as the neighboring country.
Thank you. You got me on the environmental one. There is no direct discussion of the environmental set of issues. In this sense, I think it is the book is very much really focused on development. We can come back to, in my thinking, in a way, ultimately, if sustainable in front of development to some degree is redundant, because if it's not sustainable, it's not development really. But having said that, there are a whole set of issues, whole host of issues, which connect to environment. I don't deal with that in the book, unfortunately. In the second edition, I think I'll bring that in, but right now it doesn't. On issue of brain drain, I think this was a big issue in the 60s and 70s. Brain drain. Most people nowadays are not thinking in those way. At least, again, for a large country like India, now if you look at the smaller economies in the Caribbean and so forth, it is a big issue actually, because very large proportion of those who get educated actually leave the country. These proportions going to 50%, 60%. Those are the magnitudes. India is very large, so even though you see people like me around here in plentiful numbers, when you look at what proportion of the Indian educated population we are, it's quite small actually, 3-4% or so. And for India, I think the benefits of us being outside, on balance, I think, in my judgment anyway, outweigh the losses that may have occurred to the economy, because there are lots of other links that this population that is circulating. We like to think of it now as the brain trust rather than brain drain. And it brings a lot of benefits, in terms of investments, technology, also political one. I think the Indian diaspora in the U.S. have actually turned out to be pretty effective lobby group, and certainly they played a very crucial role in the nuclear deal, nuclear cooperation deal that was agreed to. It's still not a done deal, but nevertheless, a lot of the progress on the U.S. side was influenced by the Indian diaspora as well. So I think from India's perspective, nobody is trying to discourage now the out-migration of the people from the policy side. And there is general recognition that on balance this is a plus, not a minus. So that thinking has changed. Now on energy, and so this ties into nuclear cooperation. India is very energy short. Shortage of energy in India is just enormous, and everywhere, from every source that it can get help, it needs that help. I have not understood actually. If you look at France, for example, 75% of the energy is nuclear. In the U.S., it's about 19 or 20%. When it comes to developing countries, even if you take China, for instance, it's not very large, 2.5–3% of the energy is nuclear. Which is a bit surprising to me that, but it seems to me that if France and the US can really harness that energy that effectively, why not India? So the energy angle, a lot of the press in India downplayed in the course of the debate on the nuclear energy, this cooperation deal. I personally think that this is, I think it's something that is hugely in the interest of India. There are political reasons also that it is in the interest of India, but purely from the power shortage viewpoint, I think it's very important. One has to look up at, it's going to take time. Even if, the deal happens in a year's time, for energy, for nuclear energy to become a very substantial proportion, say 15%, it'll take about 20 years. But that's the kind of time horizon you have to look at, actually, because that's where the shortages are going to become even more acute. So that finally the regional. I can't say we don't have any figures on Burma itself, but certainly rapid growth of India has certainly helped the other neighboring countries. For Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India has emerged actually as a very large market now. If you look at their trade data, their trade with India has expanded probably more rapidly than any other trade relationship for them. So it has, in that sense, happened. India has also tried to give some trade preferences. Actually, with Sri Lanka, it has a free trade area agreement. There are a lot of exceptions taken on many of the products, but nevertheless, there is a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka. One with Bangladesh also is probably in the works, but there are also the political reasons why that has not happened. Nevertheless, the opening up of India and the rapid growth has actually helped, at least the trade relations. The trade has expanded very much in the way that China has been actually the fulcrum of the expansion of trade in Asia, East Asia particularly, including Japan actually. India is also certainly coming up that way now. Big difference between India and China. China still is far more open. It's larger, and it's much more open than India. So China's share in world trade is something like 5–6%. India's is still less than 1.5%. So it's still not as large. But to the extent that it has expanded, opened up, is growing rapidly, it is helping the regional economies as well.
I want to say thanks again to Susan Gittleson, to Daniela Coleman, our alumni director, to all of you for coming, to Oxford University Press for supplying copies of this wonderful book, and especially to Professor Panagariya for a fascinating talk. Thank you.